FDA.
I almost said, hey guys, it's Friday. Yay, but it is not. It is a Wednesday. We're shaking things up with Greg Hughes no
Happy
longer
early
hanging out with
Friday.
us. Yeah. Yes, we're on Hump Day, which is equally exciting,
Session
right?
day, as we
special
like to call
session,
it.
yes.
Oh, a very special session.
Super special.
Yes. So thanks for joining us for Take Two. This is Heidi Hatch with KUTV 2 News. If you're new, Maura Carabello from the Exoro Group. And John Dougall has come down off of Capitol Hill to hang out with us today. Thanks so much for hanging.
Always a pleasure.
Little catch up first, because I feel like we've all kind of been running around. Last week we were back again. Mr. Dougall, I saw you post on Facebook that you're going to law school. Just John. All right.
Yeah.
So you're going to law school.
I am.
How did I not know this?
I don't know. I could have sworn
like
I
we've
told you,
talked
but
about it.
We have?
Yeah.
I maybe
But-
took a brain
'cause I
break.
I'm 2 years in.
Yeah.
That's like solid.
Yeah, it's been on the bucket list for 40 years, and I figured, what the heck? And, I can't just do the drop everything full time, but I'm going to Syracuse University online. I was back there for, 4 days for on-campus residency, but usually it's online, Zoom meetings, and all that type of stuff. So
I feel like it's mandatory that you have at least 3 big projects at one time.
Yeah.
You don't know what to do with yourself. I mean, it can
That's-
be family, it can be work, it can be
that's what my
community.
wife says. My
So
wife
are you
tells
going to
people,
do something with it, or you just want to check it off the list?
check it off the list for sure. I don't know what I might do with it in the future, but it's been fun. I tell my colleagues, my fellow classmates, I've never looked at my grades. They just can't imagine this concept. And I also tell them they're the least stressful finals I have ever taken in my life.
I love that, because I would love to go back to college, but I don't want to have tests. I just want to learn some stuff.
learn.
Yeah, interesting.
That'd be nice.
Well, I still have tests, but
But you just don't look.
I'm
Okay.
doing it for
Do you
learning.
finish more of your email lines with here too? Because I would just finish. I'm going to start finishing things with here too.
Ooh, you are.
No, there you go.
Instead of just saying it's attached, I'll be like,
And what's new with Maura? Because we didn't talk a lot last week. Over the summer, any life altering? You've sent your daughter back off to college.
she goes this weekend.
Oh, this weekend.
Yeah,
Okay.
she goes this weekend. We had a funeral, but it was a nice funeral. It was upbeat and busy summer.
How was the rain?
Exactly. It was the
Nothing like outdoor
heavens were
experience.
weeping that day.
Yes. Shout out to anyone who's been dealing with that, because the thing is for most of it's just like, ooh, neat. It's kind of the showers you get if you lived in the South or
Yeah,
in
it
Florida.
was
But
fun.
if it's flooding your basement or flooding your event, not fun. So
Yeah, day 2 for the shower, we were at Snowbird, and that was equally wet. So it was a wet weekend, but it is kind of fun. Those major storms they feel like events.
a good soaker.
There were storms on the eastern seaboard, and flights were canceled and delayed.
Yeah,
My flight was 3.5
You got
hours
stuck
late
in
getting
that?
out of Syracuse. We finally got off, flying to Philadelphia, got routed to Harrisburg.
Ugh.
Hey, never knew there was a Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Now you know.
Don't tell Greg Hughes. But
Yeah,
then we had to land, get more fuel, and then fly over to Philly
interesting.
I
because
feel
of
like
the
flying
storm.
is a real adventure these days. If it's not a part falling off your plane, it's weather or something else these days. So
or insufficient crews. Because I knew it was going to be bad when they called me at 5:45 in the morning
We had a
or
delay.
emailed saying your flight is delayed and we're rebooking you for tomorrow.
We had a delayed flight this summer only about a month ago because they couldn't get the air conditioning on. They just landed, so they had flown successfully, and some of the passengers were complaining about it being warm. So in the middle of the 15 minutes where they turn over, they couldn't get the air conditioning on.
Oh.
And you were like, I'll just roll down the window.
Can somebody kick it or just flip the switch
that
on
is
and
the
off?
one thing, like, if you had told me you're missing a wing, I would be like, yeah, let's see what we can do. No air conditioning. I'm like, this is an emergency. We will not be flying until there's air conditioning.
That would be
on this
so
flight.
stuffy. Well, it feels like there's no air conditioning in this room. So let's get to it. If you're watching on podcast form and you can see us and I'm waving papers at me, it's because it's hot in here. So let's get to it. There is a special session today happening at the Utah State Capitol. We're recording at
Is
about
that what they're doing up there?
something
that way all
special.
the
Yes, all the people are there. It's 2:45. We're recording right now. It doesn't happen for a couple more hours up there, but people are up there. They're talking about it. It does seem like special sessions are getting to be not as special as they used
Well,
to be.
this isn't just a special session. This is an emergency.
Session. And that's what I want to talk about, because the people, the voters, gave the legislature this power of Grayskull how many years ago? By
And then what do you describe what the Supreme Court did?
Yeah.
I know. So the people chose this, and I'm still shocked every time we talk about it. The voters decided the legislature should have this power, and it's a pretty broad power. It does say emergencies, but whose emergency is, define emergency. So, Maura,
You know what I think they should have done was said, okay, you can call yourself into special session if the governor has declared an emergency.
Oh, that's
because
nice
if it's to counterbalance,
differentiation.
if it's to counterbalance the governor, then you
Interesting.
don't call yourself in unless he declares an emergency, and then you have the ability to call yourself in. So there's kind of a check and balance.
So this is
but that's not what we have here.
Our legislature called themselves into session. They notified up this week yesterday, which is all that's required of them. They met their requirement. They actually didn't release the bill they're talking about until this morning. You could get bootlegged copies last night, but they released it this morning.
Bootleg copies.
And
Wow.
That's funny because I was reading them last night and I just grabbed them from somewhere. I don't even know where. I didn't go to the legislative webpage, so I
Right.
didn't even realize I had a bootleg copy. So
did.
sexy.
Heidi's dark web.
Yeah.
And so now they'll go in this afternoon. The main issue is changing the Utah Constitution and specifically the language around initiatives.
And this
Well,
all happened after.
proposing to
Yeah,
change it,
proposing.
because it's got to go out to the voters.
Yes.
And that'll be the interesting
placing
thing.
it on the ballot.
Because if they pass this and make the decision, we've got 75, 76 days until the election. And I find that when you have to educate people on something like this, it's complicated because even reading what they put out online already, there's a lot to go through. And this is counteracting a ruling that just came from the Utah Supreme Court, which started with something that voters voted on in the first place, starting with gerrymandering. So there's a lot to look at, a lot to understand.
It is pretty complicated. And the sense of emergency, I think they're arguing, is that if anyone who wants to be on the November ballot isn't on by the first week of September, I think it's September 3rd. It's 2nd or 3rd.
Printing happens the beginning part of September.
That's the statutory deadline. So the legislature either does this now or they won't qualify for the November ballot. The reason that's meaningful is that you have to do constitutional amendments on even years. So then the next ballot eligibility would be 2026.
In the general election.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's kind of a long ways off in terms of politics. So everyone's coming out with statements. We've actually had an amendment to the bill today, but I just want to read what Stuart Adams and House Speaker Mike Schultz, who was with us here last week, said. They said, this amendment provides a path for Utahns to weigh in and make their voices heard. The proposed amendment restores the over 100-year-old effect of citizen initiatives. The initiative process will remain unchanged, and Utahns will continue to have the ability to propose and run ballot initiatives. Democrats on the other side from House Democrats have said it's a blatant power grab following the Utah Supreme Court's ruling that the legislature overstepped with less than 24 hours until the session begins. We still haven't seen the bill, so they were frustrated. We've got the bill now. There was a clarification today, and that clarification was that they were making sure that the people, the voters, still had some power. It said they would address the deference given to a law passed by an initiative. So they're saying, don't worry, we're not going to take the power from the people. Just John. Does this take power from the people?
As I read it, yes. Now, does it take much? It all depends. And let's step back. What happened was the Supreme Court ruled when it came to the redistricting initiative and basically said there is this, we're used to thinking about the Constitution and we're used to thinking about statute. And they kind of said for initiatives, there's kind of this heightened statute that the legislature has to be more deferential to when it comes to changing of government. And this is through the legislature for a loop, and for some of us, we're used to thinking about those two big buckets, and then you create this third one that, how does that really fit, and where are the boundaries, and where are the lines? And if you look out at California, and you look, this is a state that significantly is driven by initiatives, there is valid concern to say we don't want to be like California. But you also need to say, there is a certain process for the citizens to control what their government does, and so that's where the initiative process comes in.
And let's unpack that a little more, just the history part,
Sure.
and then we can get to today. The history part is we become a state in 1896. We get the right to have citizens' initiatives in 1900. And by then, one other state had some language. Utah looked at that language, and actually the language is in the spirit of what the legislature is recommending now. And the big differentiator, which I don't think is small, is when it comes to this, is the legislature an elevated voice in citizens' initiatives or an equal voice? And we at the time in 1900 said, no, we think the citizens will be the elevated voice. So the ruling on July 10th that the Supreme Court came out with had two components. So the challenge will be, if you're a proponent for initiatives, which I am, it's too complicated. So how do you button this up? But it ruled on two sections of the statute. And one is on the issue of initiatives itself, the right to petition. And essentially the Supreme Court said, we're going to hold harmless this, the district court can decide. And that's the whole part about how to qualify to be on. Utah has one of the highest qualification bars to get on. most of us, I would argue that it's too onerous, but I would also argue that I want it
too onerous to get on, or too onerous to pass?
Too onerous to get on the ballot.
Okay.
But even having said that, I would tell you I want it to be onerous.
Okay.
Why? Because we don't want to be an initiative-driven state. I do think it's a bit of a red herring, though, to cross these wires and say that this helps eliminate ballot measures at all. The number of ballot measures is more directly related to the qualification to get on. Now, what the Supreme Court did opine upon is the second part of the initiative clause, which has to do with reforming your government via initiative. Mm-hmm. Now, to be clear, here's what's already in law. The legislature absolutely can amend right now. That's under the purview of the legislature. What they can't do is repeal. And this is what they're trying to codify. The legislature, we believe, assuming that the early drafts we've read will hold and they won't be amended, the legislature wants to repeal right now this right. And also they're referencing the section that is about reforming your government. Now, government reform has to be constitutional. So that means if you take a nonsensical approach and say, okay, we're going to do a ballot measure that says we're going to do away with the legislature. You can't do that. It would be unconstitutional. But the reason they're doing this for better boundaries is unlike Medicaid expansion, unlike marijuana, who were all the same year, those were about issues. The better boundaries was about reformation. It was about dividing the next set of jurisdictions. So it's about our government. And so they said specifically in that instance that our law, Utah's law as it is now, as it is written now, gives higher precedent to the initiative process in that the legislature can amend it, but they can't counter it or kill it, right? You can clean it up. You can make it compliant. You can even structurally make large changes to make it compliant with current law. What you can't do is say, no thanks, we're going to kill it. And that was the basis. But those are two different...
On the kill it thing, though, is if you amend it, you can amend it substantially in line with the initiative intent, but you can't amend it
to disregard
out of existence.
So if it goes towards repeal, does that take away power from voters that they have and have had in the past where they're going to have less power?
Directly. I mean, as someone so this is also about frequency. I have probably done more ballot measures than anyone in the state of Utah.
The ballot queen.
Is that a good thing?
No. Well, yeah, I'm going to say it is. I'm going to say it's a great thing, but let me tell you where the gaslighting comes in.
Just a sec, you flip-flop.
It's a great thing. It's terrific. And I have done 4 in 20 years. So before we get on we're so afraid of California.
So you're doing them every 5 years?
Yeah, right? And of the 4, only 2 made it on the ballot because they were brokered before. Count My Vote is a classic example of brokering before you get on the ballot. And of the 2, only 1 was passed. So my point in all of this is to say we already have safeguards in place. So if someone tells you, but for this law, we will be California, that is an apple to a kumquat. The other part of it is...
But that is the fear that's being put out there.
That's the fear-mongering that is being put out there. But we've already got an onerous task to get on. And in fact, the early proposals actually made getting on easier. The carrot that they were giving today was, we'll give you 20 more days. So it's interesting. And again, the status quo is that they can amend the law. They just can't reject. And so what they're asserting, so this is a direct attack on the people's rights to have equal power to the people that they have hired. And the other thing that we keep forgetting is that when a ballot measure is passed, it's because the majority of the citizens wanted it. It is the will of the people. That's the definition of the election.
But, so let me flag 2 things. So Maura talked about, and I'll give the examples, recreational marijuana. If somebody ran an initiative, there's some question in the legislature whether or not they'd have to respect that. I think most folks say probably not, because that's not reforming your government. But if there was a push for a jungle primary, meaning get rid of the partisan primaries and just say everybody's in the primary ballot, top 2 go on to the general election, that probably would be considered reforming your government, so that would be allowed to stand.
Right, if it was passed.
Right.
I mean, again, if the majority of the people wanted it to be so, the question is, why would you allow representatives to supersede your direct right to govern yourself?
Now, the other key thing, and I'll just flag, and I'll pick the example of a referendum trying to,
take something off.
Ultimately did take off the school voucher back when I was in the legislature in the what was it, 2008 timeframe, 2007 timeframe. One of the key things is we would look to say not what was the vote statewide, but what was the vote in our district? Did it pass or fail in our respective districts? And that's where just because something passes statewide doesn't necessarily mean it's representative of each of those districts where the representatives are from.
When you all pass a bill in the legislature, whether my representative voted for it or not, it's my law, right? So one doesn't get to pick and choose when one wants to follow the law. So when the state legislature, I live in a Democratic district, and very seldom is my representative on the winning side. And yet I understand and believe that I have to adhere to all the laws that the legislature pass. So when I look and they say no,
I'm just flagging the nuance of what does a majority mean? Majority of voters statewide or majority of the various districts?
But we all have to live with the majority vote, whether in our household or in our county or in our legal jurisdiction. We all have to live with it. And I think this
you vote in your household?
I think
how much vote do your kids get?
The argument for me about, hey, my group of people don't like it is not how laws are passed or respected.
So bottom line, if this passes in the legislature, your vote is no on the ballot this November.
Yeah, I mean, more than anything, you set it up well. I think it's complicated, and I think it bears a little bit of reading. One of the reading, I wouldn't read the whole thing. It's 84 pages.
I started looking and I stopped because I'm like,
but it's in plain language.
The constitutional,
the Supreme, the 11th, the Supreme Court.
Yes.
But it's plain language. So skip the history part. But it's very plain language. But I do think it's critical that people understand that they are having some of their rights. They may agree with this. I'm not, but that this is about taking something out of the Constitution that the people currently have. And they may decide that the legislature is spot on about that and they want to support it. But I wouldn't blow this off. I see early messaging being, oh, this is a technical cleanup. In fact, in legislative leaders' language, they say this will do nothing. To which I say, then why are you
having a session?
Right. Yeah. And I also...
Then it's just a message bill.
And then my cheeky part will say, when people in power tell you that you should give up your power because it's in your interest, don't believe the people in power.
Interesting. I'm going to...
Do you second her motion, or are you on a different side here and you say, hey, let's put it on the ballot and I may vote for this?
I got to actually see what gets on the ballot because right now it's in flux and it's kind of changing. I hate to commit, I'd support that when I haven't yet seen what the final language is. But I'm going to flag, there's a couple things at play. First of all, the legislature is clearly frustrated with the Supreme Court.
By frustrated, you mean anybody who disagrees with them agrees that they say you're not valid.
Well, there are times they're frustrated with me because of, me pushing back. But you look and say, okay, whether it's on the redistricting opinion or whether it's on the abortion opinion, both of those did not go in the direction the legislature wanted. And so they're agitated about where the Supreme Court's at for the state of Utah and what that means. And so that's one of those things that's just, kind of bubbling under the surface there for folks to remember.
So I completely agree. I would like more insight to, how do I say this without,
are you trying to be nice?
I'm trying to be, I really want to know why the supermajority being annoyed with other people's opinions is a crisis. I've been on the losings. I've fought the good fight a million times. I don't think my opponents are wrong. I just think that we disagree and I lost and you won. But it seems like when anyone challenges the current thinking of the legislature, the answer is they are somehow wrong. I mean, this was a unanimous opinion by Republican-appointed justices. And the response back was, you guys are totally wrong.
Yeah. We're going to watch this carefully. We've got Brian Malahy up on Utah's Capitol Hill keeping track of this one.
There's one other constitutional amendment that's on the ballot. It deals with tax, whether income tax should be earmarked for education and certain other restrictions, or should that earmark be taken away. And if voters are agitated about this and vote no against this constitutional amendment, then I have a question of whether they'll just vote no on everything, or whether they'll be more selective.
Yeah. And
because the legislature could end up losing that one too.
And both of them are big deals. So that's going to be interesting.
I'm not in charge of the world, but if I were, I would say if you want those bills to pass, they have to get out there. And we've talked about using the bully pulpit and helping people understand. But once we get to Labor Day, they've got a small window to convince voters whether they vote for or against this. But I think the education is so important because I think right now people are like, what? What are we voting on? What does this change? How does it affect me?
And what's the saying? If you're explaining, you're losing. And it's easy to say, this takes voters' power away, and it's hard to explain the other side.
I also, one understanding that I would like the auditor to follow up on. My understanding is they're circumventing the normal drafting period. Normally, you have to have your draft ballot language checked by Ledge Research and neutral bodies. My understanding, so this is just a rumor, my understanding is that in the course of this, they are going to waive the check and that the legislation as passed will be the ballot language. So there is no guarantee of neutrality. Now, I'm a little suspicious of that rumor because that wouldn't be best practice at all. But I would watch to see if you have a neutral party draft the ballot language or if, in fact, it's from a point of view, which would be how the legislation will likely turn out.
Yeah, I hope that they get that neutral voice in there because it's certainly an important one. And I think that it's important if you're listening right now that we see the legislature pass things all the time and they'll go in and amend them because they realize that there were unintended consequences and there's fixes that need to be done all the time. The question is, do you want them to fix or do you want them to cancel? And that's the big question I think we're dealing with right now. Another thing going on right now that happened this week, Utah is suing the federal government to gain control of millions of acres of public land. Utah and a lot of western states don't have the rights to a lot of the land that we have here in the great state of Utah. Democrats usually are like, keep your big RV campers. Did you see that commercial that the state came out with where it was... Maybe it'd be on Twitter. No. For this, there was a guy in a big RV, and he was from the 70s
Bring your
or
ATV,
80s. And like they were wanting to go on some of the public lands, but there was a little rope across the road saying you can't go. And Democrats online are like, of course you can't take your big stupid RV out there. And Republicans are saying, I'll take it wherever I want. This is our land. So
God-given right.
Yes. So the question is,
to RV.
When we look at this, to RV or take whatever you've got, should we have more power, John, to our land here? Because we do have a large portion of the state. We look at fights over BLM land, and the people who are in charge of it are a long, long ways away from here.
Yeah, so the state of Utah, about 2/3 of the state of Utah is controlled by the federal government. We're only second to Nevada, which is somewhere around 87%. And other western states are in the 40, 50, 60%. And so, the federal government has massive power in Utah. And I tell folks, whoever controls the land controls the economy. So in too much of rural Utah especially, the federal government is who's controlling the economy. And that's a concern. And the federal government promised at statehood that they would sell off this land. And that's what this lawsuit's about is you made this promise, you made this commitment, and you are not living up to it. And so we hear the stories of homesteading. And so other states that were western states back then, but we would call Midwest, they were controlled by the federal government. They went through homesteading and so forth. Lands were sold off. Lands were given to folks as part of their homesteads. And so that's now in private hands. That did not really take place in Utah.
The pinky promise never works.
Yeah. And so that is really what this lawsuit's about. And I think there's a question which is given some of the shifts and changes in the Supreme Court, whether they're now, you look at Chevron deference and so forth, whether they might be open to this kind of discussion, which is they made this promise, they made this commitment, they're not living up to it. Can they really hold on to it in perpetuity, given the promise?
So, Maura, when we look at federalism and giving more rights to states and being able to control the land and what's happening in their own backyard, is there value to this, or is this a bad idea because we're just going to drill, baby, drill, no matter where we get an option to take the land?
I'm going to stay maybe with the legal analysis. I think that the BLM and the EPA particularly, whether you're on the left or the right, they're frustrating. They even think they have too many ordinances. It takes too long to do it, everything. They contradict themselves. And so trying to get good policy right now from land management and environmental conditions is really difficult. And we're always frustrated with it. Now, I will say, we also tout that we're the best managed state and that our economy is doing well. So we can't sort of argue too much that we're being suffered. But a couple of things that I think have to bring the context of this lawsuit. Bold lawsuit. We've been threatening to do it for decades. it's really interesting and frankly bold that our leaders did it. So on one hand, good for little Utah standing up. We're going to spend millions and millions of dollars fighting this lawsuit. So let's talk about how I perceive it being successful. And so then I question, is this how to do it and how to spend our taxpayer money? In the settlement, the homestead agreement that John referred to, it comes at a time in history, remember, where Utah had flipped off the federal government. That's why we have statehood 40 years later.
We're not going to take it.
And so we had come to an aggressive settlement, and we also refused somewhat to perform and participate in the homestead agreements because we were still a little ticked off. So when we got statehood, the enabling...
A little ticked off.
We were really ticked off. Utah Enabling Act of 1894. So this is the guiding document from the federal government, says, and this is a direct quote, that the people inhabiting said proposed state do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public land lying within the boundaries thereof. That's a direct quote. That was the agreement that Utah signed to become a state. I know we hate it now. I know we have frustrations with it. It goes on to have Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. This is the property clause. It guarantees Congress the right to power to dispose of and make rules and regulations. It goes on. I won't read it.
Were we under duress because we wanted to keep extra wives and we're like, we'll sign whatever?
Maybe.
Give me the dotted line.
But we signed that agreement. We had to give up our wives already. But we also...
Or at least hide your wives.
Or at least the
hide
new
your
ones,
wives, yeah.
the new possible ones.
But this is the legal challenge with saying, give us our land back. Well, Utah never owned that land. The territory may have felt like it was theirs, but the state of Utah never owned that land. So it'll be on a narrow definition.
And we got so screwed over. I mean, remember the state of Deseret? That was massive.
It was good stuff, but we had a problem with, we were not following federal law. Ugh. And Utah gets a lot of federal money. So I agree with the frustration that we have over land management, but this isn't our land. And I know we want it to be, and I know we think that because we've been using it for so long, it's ours, but it's not. It's the federal government's. And I wonder if using that money would be more effective to actually build better relationships and bridges at a federal level and help change the regulatory environment. We've had Republicans in place for years, and Utah didn't move the ball on the regulatory environment. Don't let people believe that this is only a problem when the Democrats are in the White House. This overreach of regulation happens whether Republicans or Democrats are in the White House, and that's a problem.
Oh, yeah.
We're all of the federal government
We're all freaked out of who's president, and it's because we've given too much power to the federal government.
And we have. And so I agree with that, but on face, in plain language, when we signed up to be a state, we knew that this was federal land.
And then it's just hard times when you're looking for grazing rights and all that kind of stuff. So
what it is, right? I mean, I hear the complaints, but they're trying to remedy it through what I think will be an unsuccessful legal action, and I think there are better remedies.
All right, we're going to keep an eye on this. I think this is not going to resolve itself quickly.
What do you think?
I'm not allowed to tell you what I think. I'm just here to listen to your great conversations. But I do think it brings up an interesting question that I think other states are going to be watching, and we'll get something out of it. I know. Yeah, exactly. So, I think it's an interesting question. And I think the interesting thing when you look at this is if you listen to both sides, I think there's good points from both sides as to why we would want or not want it. And so I guess it'll be interesting watching this expensive case play out.
I would like to tell us how much it'll cost the state to do this little activity.
It won't be cheap. I mean, anytime that you're trying to avoid, sorry, turning down your mic. Thanks. Anytime you're trying to avoid the courts, it's going to save you money. And we're obviously going to the courts. I mean, we're just looking at what happened in Utah with an execution we just recently had. And it was, $280,000 for an execution. And when you look at all the money that goes into it, they were willing to pay more money than they originally wanted to because they just didn't want to fight it out in the courts anymore.
How much will it cost us if we managed this? So if we got our desire, that is a huge budgetary impact that I'm assuming the feds won't pay for anymore if we want to manage this. Well, the question is,
what is the tax revenue that's generated off of it versus the cost to manage it?
And
right now we deal with costs to manage, meaning, emergency rescue and so forth.
Exactly.
And we're not paid for it, but we got to respond.
Well, speaking of things that we're not resolving quickly right now, the primary election feels like it was 12 years ago, but we're still fighting that out.
It was only 10.
Okay, it was only 10 years ago. But I'm like, how are we still here? 2 audits are now underway of the Davis County Clerk's Office signature validation process. This came into question.
It's really the lieutenant governor's signature validation process
that she passed,
performed by Davis County.
Performed by Davis County because they needed a neutral party because our lieutenant governor oversees the election and was part of the election.
They also have the technical expertise.
Yes, and so I don't know if you're allowed to talk about this at all, but there's going to be one state auditor audit and the Utah State Legislature audit. How quickly is this going to happen, and is it important to get her done before we get to the November election so people can feel confident in what's happening with their elections?
I think it's important to get it done sooner rather than later, just because clearly there's some litigation going on that stalled the ability to engage in the audit. And so now we're jumping on it as soon as we can. We're looking at it as we announced from 2 perspectives. I will describe it as the privacy aspect, looking specifically at the control over and disclosure of voter registration information. Some of that is private and or withheld. And so looking at that, the other aspect is looking at the validation process in regards to signature gathering by candidates. And so those 2 aspects are what we're looking at as part of what we call our limited review. And some people are like, well, why is it limited? Why isn't it, audit everything? Well, we're not going in to audit every aspect of everything the Lieutenant Governor's election office does, their expenditures and so forth. We're just looking at certain activities to see, did they follow statute? Did they engage appropriately? What's the nature of what took place?
So when Phil Lyman says he has a right to see all of these signatures and the ones that are private, do you think he has a right to see all of this? Or are you the best bet to look at it and tell him that?
I will have a better understanding once we've looked over statute. We've had some initial discussions, but we will then, hear what the Lieutenant Governor's office says, what Davis County says in terms of their practices and in terms of what they believe statute means. And then we will be able to issue our opinion based on what we see.
So you've set the parameters and the scope of your audit, but have not begun the audit yet.
Have not officially begun the audit. We've done some what we call initial survey work, but not the official audit.
And then the second audit is a call to have the legislative auditors. Mm-hmm. They have not set their parameters yet. In fact, they just got the request to do this yesterday.
Yeah,
yesterday afternoon.
So they have not set the parameters. And again, as John well said, the parameters matter because that indicates how long it will take, how in-depth, how complicated it is. I interviewed the Davis County clerk this morning, and he points out that he's a subcontractor to it. He's a neutral party with the expertise and the professional staff, and he reiterated he's good to go. Anybody want to audit him, he welcomes them in. He'll facilitate the process. He doesn't initiate it, and his is just to provide the backup information. His is to facilitate both of these audits. But it will be interesting to see how long it takes because the request came in yesterday. The call to audit came from Governor Cox, John Curtis, and Derek Miller. Derek Brown.
Derek Brown. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks.
Let's hear it for the Solid Chamber of Commerce.
and randomly the chamber came in. No, Derek Brown, the candidate for HE, and they are the ones who request that the state legislature also considers a secondary audit.
And hopefully they'll get that done quickly.
And ironically, we didn't necessarily know each other was doing this when
you dove into it.
So interesting.
Dove in.
Is it a good idea to have 2 different bodies doing it, or is it wasting our money doing it twice?
Historically, we have done a good job coordinating between us and the Legislative Auditor General's office in terms of making sure we're not being redundant and so
But
forth.
didn't they already do? Isn't this the 3rd and 4th audit?
So the Legislative Auditor General is already engaged in an audit of certain aspects of the election process.
In Washington County or
just
in Davis too?
Statewide.
Okay.
Statewide. And it's just not dealing with the signature
portion
of it.
It was just more of the vote count.
And when I had called them, 4 or 5 weeks ago and said, "Are you guys looking at this?" No, it's not. That's when we started doing what we call our survey work.
Okay. And this is all moving forward because finally the Utah Supreme Court's been busy. They dismissed Lyman's case because he wanted Governor Cox and Lieutenant Governor Henderson kicked out of office, take them off the November ballot, and then Lyman wanted to be put in his place on the November ballot. That obviously did not happen. So now this is moving forward.
But it's interesting because I think Lyman has exhausted all of his
the state of Utah?
Choice. He's exhausted all of his
meter is going down.
his remedies. So these audits are interesting because they're not at the bequest of Lyman. They're in addition. I think in yesterday's request, it's sort of the rationale was that this is going perhaps above and beyond to assure the voters that the process was clean because there was a question. But to be clear, Lyman has exhausted his choices.
That's right. And he has, I believe, and he's said that he's going to run as a write-in at this point, and you have to file to be a write-in. A lot of people think that you can just write someone on the line, but when you vote for your mom, or Mitt Romney says he votes for his wife, or Governor Cox when he's not voting for Trump.
I voted for you before.
You did? Yes. Yeah. But they didn't even count my name. Did you register?
I did.
See, that's the problem. People at home don't know that you, if you're voting.
Voted.
Yeah. They don't count for you. So you have to file with the state 65 days out, which Lyman will have to do. I don't think he's done that yet. And you have to say you're running as a write-in so they'll actually count them. So now I'm sad that I haven't been counted before.
Well, one of the things I'll just throw in is I get the candidates, litigating along the way. This is one of the things that some folks are like, why haven't you audited sooner? Partly because we had litigation going on, trying to let that clear out of the way. It doesn't necessarily prohibit it, but it does make it, a conflict and an interference in the process because personnel are tied up dealing with litigation and not available to deal with an audit.
Yeah. So, Maura, asking you about this one. So, Lyman came out with a surprise ad with Brian King, and they both have a dog in the fight saying, hey, we agree on one thing. We do not want Spencer Cox to be the governor. Was that a surprise you didn't have on your bingo card this year?
I didn't. I did not see this coming. I think it... I'm not going.
You sunk my battleship.
Exactly. I think that I won't opine about whether it was good or bad strategy. I think the strategy was to get attention, and they got attention.
Yeah,
I was really surprised that not only did we all pay attention, I was really surprised that the powers that be sort of paid attention. One would normally say, ignore and dismiss your opponents who are trying to get attention.
They've reacted.
They reacted. I thought that was not probably the best play, but I guess good for Brian and good for Phil. Interestingly enough, Brian King seems to have gotten a round of applause from the Democrats. Phil Lyman seems to have once again maybe not endeared himself to the average Republican.
Or even those that were supporters of his at convention are concerned going, oh, wait a second. You are now telling us not to back the Republican nominee and back a Democrat instead. And I'm hearing from a lot of folks, they're not the Cox team. They're the, Phil Lyman group going, wait a second. No, that's beyond the pale. That's a step too far for us.
Yeah, and it depends on who you're looking at. 'Cause some on social media are like, yeah, I'll back you all the way. We'll do everything we can to make sure that, we vote you in. But Rob Axon, who's the chair of the Utah Republican Party, who obviously where Lyman keeps going back to, and he's like, I won the caucus convention system. And he's like, okay, you did, but you didn't win the primary, and now we're going to support Cox. Is that the right move for Republicans right now?
Well, I think that's the world they live in. And while Republicans say we like the caucus convention system, unfortunately, from my perspective, the Republican Party wants to take subsidies and direct payments from the state, which means the taxpayers get to control what goes on, and the taxpayers, via the legislature, has dictated an alternative route to the ballot. And that is the world we live in.
28,000 signatures. And Lyman, interestingly enough, signed on to gather signatures in the first place, which he could have if he wanted to. And I think he started gathering and stopped. So he knows that's a process to get on the ballot. He signed up for that option.
This is the same Phil Lyman that voted for the bill that made these voter records private as well. I mean, Phil's living by the sword that he uses a lot. And that it sounds like it's a hard row, but, he was a part of making all of these laws.
All right, we're going to keep watching that. I do have to give a shout out to Celeste Maloy. She is now, after the last week, the official winner in the CD2 case. After the recounts and everything's done there, she did win by a very slim margin. Can I escape?
Man, that was a really tight margin.
176 votes, I think, is what ultimately separated the two. Should I leave the two of you to talk amongst yourselves, and I'm going to grab Maura some water? Would you like some water?
I'm probably good. I've got a lozenge.
All right.
That's why
sharing water.
I'll grab John's if it gets too
if you need it. So that one's finally finished. We're going to be heading to the November election very soon in that one.
I don't think anybody thought it was going to be that close.
It was close. It just goes to show how important it is to get out there and vote. And the case that had been filed in the courts there has been tossed out and done too. In that case, Colby Jenkins was trying to say, hey, we need to count, I think it was more than 1,000 ballots in Washington and Iron counties that had been postmarked too late. But the court said, I'm sorry, the rule is that you vote when you vote, and if you're late, it doesn't count.
Well, and I'm not sure who his legal counsel was, but I listened to part of the presentation to the Supreme Court. And when you got Justice Pierce basically saying, now, you know you're presenting to the Utah Supreme Court, don't you? And to find out that they had misrepresented the status of when ballots were going to be printed. So the Supreme Court raced into this emergency hearing to find out it wasn't the emergency that they were claiming and other things like that. It did not go well.
It did not go well. And now it is done and over with, which is a reminder if you're listening, and this, I guess, should be part of the education process still because people haven't figured it out. How long have we been doing the mail-in ballots in Utah? Like a decade at least, right?
Quite a while.
Yeah, and Utah County, I know, was slow to adapt. They had a few kinks in the road when they were slow to join. But at this point, people, you really just have to read when it's due. And if you're not dropping it in the mail at least a few days before, go drop it in the ballot box. Everyone has one within a couple of miles of their home, even if you're rural. It's not that
except
far.
in rural.
How far away are those?
Well, some of those to the next closest town, you might drive an hour or more each way.
So mail it.
You go to San Juan County, it's a massive distance.
But also, I will just say anecdotally of the charge of they sent these to Las Vegas. I mean, I would remind people
Salt Lake is further away.
Salt Lake is further away. I'm like, yes, the Las Vegas would have been a lot closer than any place else. But, you know, Colby Jenkins ran a really competitive race for a first-timer. And I will say, I think it is a lot harder to lose by a little bit. I mean, that's a hard race.
It's like the Olympics and you come in second.
Yeah.
You get the silver and it's
you
like,
were
I was so
there.
close.
Yeah.
You'd rather just be knocked out of contention at all. I would think, too, if you lose, you'd rather just get, a good whomping, and then you could just be like, well, better luck next time.
Well, and I'm one of those. I would prefer that all the ballots are received by 8 o'clock on the night of the election rather than it dragging out forever. But I look at some of these folks who, in 2020 with Trump, they agreed with him. They shouldn't come in after the election night. And in this case, they're saying not only should they come in after election night, they should come in after the postmark that was required for them, and they should still be counted. It's like, well, where's the consistent principle?
We want it both ways, depending on what could help.
What's best for us?
Yeah, which is frustrating. And I do miss. I've talked about this before. I like having the ballot, especially when you have initiatives. You can sit down at your kitchen table, you can hash through them, read them, and have time. But I do miss the pomp and circumstance of actual. Everyone shows up and does something on the same day. It feels patriotic and good, and you have those results.
Visit with your friends and neighbors.
Yes, I miss that. So I mean, there's things that we've given up to have those mail-in ballots, but you've just got to read the envelope and follow the rules. So
don't worry, you still get the sticker.
You still get the sticker.
I know, but then I save the sticker for election day, and then I forget.
And it doesn't matter. The stickers are so dumb at this point because the reason why you have it is to say you showed up that day. So you don't want to just randomly wear it on any day. It's like, who cares?
I'm just a little surprised you didn't say tune in at 10 o'clock to listen. We'll explain the ballot initiatives to you. We'll explain the candidates.
Yes.
Versus study it yourself.
Yes. No, we'll be doing that. But sometimes you go and you want to read the language again and again, and especially if you've got
Groundhog Day.
Yeah, especially if you've got younger voters. My kids are now 24 and 18, and I like being able to sit down. You obviously don't tell your kids how to vote, but I think as a family being able to sit down and read and understand the ballot initiatives and talk about what they mean and talk about the language because it's not always clear. I think it's nice to be able to have that option. So that is good to have. So a couple of things we have to talk about. There's a little something going on right now called the Democratic National Convention. It's been interesting to watch.
Hope and change, baby. Hope and change.
They have a lot of energy, I will say. The Democrats have a lot of big names. We're talking Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, excellent orators. When they speak, people listen. The thing that's been interesting to me, just a couple things. Biden, I feel like, kind of got screwed a little bit by how late he went on that first night. Plus, I feel like they were trying to get him out of the way. Yes, because first night is not the sexy night. You're building up.
Third chair.
Yeah. So I thought it was kind of interesting that he was probably promised, a stage to say his goodbyes. He came off angry to me, and then I was waiting for Michelle and Barack Obama, and they're the hope, the change. When they go low, we go high. I don't know how much you listened to this, Maura, but I was kind of surprised. Michelle gave an excellent speech. She had the crowd in her hands, but she didn't do the we go high. She went flamethrowing, I think. It was kind of interesting.
She was on fire.
When they go low, we go lower.
Yeah. Well, this time it switched up.
I would say that that's a little unfair characterization of her. I think she was on fire. She was partisan. Her reviews today are rave from both sides of the punditry, that she did really well. She outshone everyone that night, including
her husband.
Barack Obama.
Yeah.
And she had that crowd chanting. And the chants were all very positive. She delivered one of the smartest call to actions that I have heard
using
from
her
a
mom's
political
words?
speech. Well, her whole point was, nobody's going to ask you. Do it yourself. Get in there. Make it happen for you. And
Should she have been the nominee?
Well, she's not the vice president, and I think that Joe Biden agreed to the first night. I think that was a night all about him, and it was a little awkward, but it was all about him. But hats off to the Democrats who handled this transition at all, right? I mean, this could have been chaos and a split convention, and it hasn't been. I also thought
Democrats have done an amazing job with that, and I think a lot of Obama's former teams doing this, they're orchestrating really well.
And they knew the Hillary-Obama schism. Like, that was really hard for the Democrats. Doug Emhoff, is that how he says his name? Yeah. I thought he was great. Like, he was so folksy. He told the story about the first time he asked her out. He sounded like a dope when he did it. He goes on to say, the voicemail at 8:30 in the morning. If you haven't listened to this from not a partisan point of view, it's a cute story in which now she makes him listen to that on their anniversary because he was such a dope when he first asked her out.
Thursday?
Yeah, and so he really humanized her, which is the goal. It'll be interesting tonight. Tonight has some interesting dynamics because first time with it, we're going to see our candidate for vice president, Tim Walz. Most of us don't know him live. It'll be interesting to see how they frame him up. Many of the Democratic folks, I would say I am among those who believe it should be about him as a teacher and a coach.
Not a Bernie bro.
Yeah, exactly, and really just frame him up. The other interesting one tonight is Bill Clinton. And so one of the things
he's a skilled orator himself,
but he can get a little self-involved, right? So one of the things that the Obamas did well is it was about Kamala Harris, and it was about the party, and it was about you taking action, and it was about going forward. They didn't regale themselves with stories of themselves. I hope Clinton stays in that vein tonight and doesn't just regale us with stories of the good old days.
I have been surprised by how often they've said Trump's name. I was thinking they would probably stay away from that and really talk more policy, but they have been talking Kamala, which is interesting.
Before you throw that to John, we had the Utah Democratic Party chairman who's there.
Yeah.
And we asked him that question. I too was like, wow, they seem to be trumping it up a lot. His response was interesting, and it resonates with me. It sounds true. He said, sure, I'm sure that's the zingers and the bites that the media is pulling out. He said from his perspective, he doesn't think he's hearing that much about Trump.
Interesting.
So if you're sitting through the whole 12 hours of speeches every day, if you're sitting through the early and the late.
You are dedicated. You deserve a trophy.
You're crazy. But they're saying he did not feel like it was particularly Trump-focused, that he felt like that was a byproduct of what the media chose to grab as a recap.
Do you feel like Republicans have lost all momentum right now? Because when we looked at the RNC, I think they had more energy than they usually do. I think everyone was really solidified behind Trump, especially right after the assassination attempt. But now,
and Biden was flailing, and it was like, we can't lose this thing. And then right now, I wouldn't say they've lost all momentum, but they've substantially lost momentum. Kamala's, I would say, getting a pass, not really getting asked the hard questions, and so therefore she's still in the honeymoon period.
She's the girl on fire.
Yeah. And so in comparison,
Have you heard anything that's hopeful to you? Because just a couple of weeks ago after the assassination attempt.
I've heard hope about more taxes, more government spending, more government regulation. That's the hope I keep hearing when I flip it on. It does to a guy like me, and I'm not a Trump fan, but I listen to what the Democrats are saying, and to me, it's a disaster.
They haven't talked you into the idea that she brings hope and change?
No.
One thing I do think is interesting is they've been talking a lot about Kamala, when she's been out on the stage talking about food prices. And if you put me in charge, I'll be in charge. But it's funny to me that she is in charge and saying that. It's kind of like she's running while not being in office the way she talks, which I think is an interesting thing to listen to as well.
Yeah.
All disrespect, all respect to vice presidents.
Step off, everybody.
Nobody thinks the vice president's in charge. So I now know.
Unless you're Dick Cheney.
And now, well, he's the exception. He did run our country, and he did, a reasonably good job. But it is interesting. I think that is the accusation, and I would keep saying it if I were a member of the media, if I were a Republican. But who calls the shots in the United States of America is the President of the United States of America. It's not a joint action. This is an advisor. It's an important figure. It has major roles. It's the deciding vote on key issues in the Senate, which she has done. This is a position that matters, but the President of the United States is who runs the United States.
So she's going to suck up and get all the good credit she can as being part of the administration and distance herself as much as possible from anything she thinks is going to cause her a problem.
Yeah. Which is just playbook 101, right?
Yeah.
Every president takes credit for the good and shuns the bad. And
this is kind of like the legislature.
This is like
even if you voted no on something,
elected officials.
Hey, if this is viewed as good, hey, I was in the legislature
It's
when
mine.
we did this.
Yeah.
But if you don't like it, that was not me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So
Even if you voted yes, it wasn't
the
me.
politics of politics. And the politics continue for 2 more nights. And so, this is, Democrats' chance to celebrate.
This is your warning.
This is, so it's going on. We're going on
only
late for 2 more
halfway through.
nights. I know. For us in the news business, it's just like, are we done yet? Because the RNC and DNC, it's just like, oh my gosh, how late is this news going to go on? And it's partially because the networks choose to, after it's over with, run a whole nother hour
Why
show
did they
afterwards.
do that? I don't like that.
I don't like it either, but I don't know the decision making. They usually try to play to the East Coast station, so I think they're trying to get out and cut on time to go to
Isn't
them.
that like
but yes,
midnight?
Yeah, it's late.
Yeah. It's late out there, but I want your perspective on Kamala. So I don't think she's being asked the hard questions as a news person, as a reporter, as a anchor. What are your thoughts? Is she going to get asked the hard questions?
I hope
Is
so.
The media going to?
But I think it's weird watching Republicans talk about this nonstop, because I don't think it helps Republicans' cause if they want to be like, she won't answer questions. Run your campaign, tell us what you're running on, and do it. But I do hope she answers questions, because I think the question I have as a journalist, and I think voters probably have at home, is where is she running? Because Kamala Harris, when she ran for president, ran to the far left of everyone who was on the stage then. So the question is she that same candidate, or has she moderated? Where does she stand on the issues? So that needs to happen. And a lot of people were making fun of or thinking that the Elon Musk interview shouldn't happen on Twitter. And I don't even know if it was an interview. He called it conversation, whatever it is. I think
it was
more,
like a 2-hour chat.
Yeah, and I think more of that, even if it's not a journalist just sitting down and talking, you get things out of them. If you listen to the first hour of that, I think it was Trump getting in his talking points like any politician. But after about an hour and them talking, I was like, okay, this is interesting. You're hearing more of who this candidate is. What does he think about things? And I think that we really need to hear from Harris in interview style, talking about where she stands on the issues and just learn more about her, because I don't think we know a lot about her. So I hope we get to that point when we're done with the celebrations of the RNC and the DNC, where we start asking tough questions. And I hope that we have more than one debate. We know that they've agreed to one debate at this point. I know that Trump threw out, I think, 3, and it's still only agreed on 1. I think it would be nice. Maura, will they listen to 3? Will it change any minds? Or am I just like wanting things that are just not realistic and we don't need?
I think all 3 of us agree. We love debates, but we're probably one of 8% watching and really weighing those
Does it change the mind? Look at June, Trump versus
think
Biden. It changed minds.
It changed minds
this is
there,
a referendum on Trump by and large.
At this point, yeah.
There are many of us who are just like, I'm not voting for Trump, so as long as, they're not horrible. I also think there's a slight bit of disingenuousness about saying Kamala hasn't laid out a philosophy. Trump talks a lot, but says very little that's policy focused. He does a lot of headlines. He does a lot of red meat. No one is better at winding up the crowd and giving people a lot of sugar, giving people the feeling that they've eaten something only to later find out there was no protein there. So, I do think she owes an explanation, but I will say it's a little critical. I totally agree with you strategically. Republicans keep on keeping on, because it's not, you don't have your eyes on the prize if you're talking about your opponent. And so far, that's been Trump's problem. Before, he's always been really good about pivoting back to him, and he is still a little obsessive about her.
I don't think he fully knows how to respond to this, and he was
not
so
helpful.
in on the one path.
He was
he's
so
struggling,
Biden.
he's struggling to
Like
pivot.
yeah.
He's struggling to pivot.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing. Part of me wonders if he was really running just because he wanted to teach Biden a lesson and like beat him after what had happened, and now he's just trying to, recalibrate and figure out his election moving forward.
Well, he's going to think the Democrats cheated on him.
Well, that was a predetermined conclusion that if he loses, somebody cheated.
No. But right now, you swapped horses mid.
Yeah.
You cheated.
An indication of sort of the stress that they're under in trying to find a path is JFK. Interestingly enough, this leak came from his vice president.
RFK.
Sorry.
JFK back for the dead.
He's dead.
He might be.
And the leak has been traced back to the woman who he chose as his vice president. Well, she sort of indicated that they might be considering quitting the race. And their rationale for it is they believe at this point that their voter base is largely being pulled from the Trump voter base.
So they are feeling that they're a spoiler.
Like they're a spoiler. It's not a settled issue as the junkies will know. A couple of months ago, he was in the double digits. He was even up at around 15% to some. And that's like a big stinking deal for a third party.
I think a lot of Democrats.
Ross Perot.
He's dropped into 8 or 9. I still thought there was a bigger question about who he was pulling from. I think he's pulling from a little bit of each. But the rationale from their campaign, if they haven't yet, but if they choose to not keep going, the rationale was they think they're pulling too many Trump votes.
Yeah. I think he was pulling more Democrats when Biden was there because I think there was more independents and maybe some Democrats that were like, okay, we need someone who's a little younger, who a little more like ready to go. And so I think the votes were there. But now that Kamala's there, I think that maybe he's pulling more just from Trump's. Interestingly enough, they have put out a press release, and he is going to be addressing the nation live on Friday afternoon from Phoenix, Arizona, which is where former President Trump will also be campaigning. I think he's in Glendale that afternoon at a Turning Point USA PAC meeting of some sort. So the question is, are they in the same city because they're going to be joining forces, or is it something else? So I'm kind of leaning towards the fact that he drops out and maybe there's some kind of agreement. There was an interview with Trump yesterday when someone said, hey, if RFK, joined your team, would you have a place for him? And he's like, oh, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it. And it sounded sincere. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. So what calls are going on behind the scenes, I do not know.
Well, I want to go back to Elon Musk.
Yes.
Okay, so Elon Musk in the cabinet.
Yeah.
What agency would you have him oversee?
Yeah, so if Robert Kennedy is going to clearly do the FDA, and so he's going to be an
no vaccine.
Is he going to be FDA or is he going to be the CIA because he wants to get to the bottom of his family's?
Or do you combine them,
The FDA and the CIA?
Why not?
I would love it.
And then John said this earlier, so I can't take credit for this, but I agreed with John that Musk should be transportation.
You look at Tesla, you look at SpaceX. Boom, transportation.
All right.
Yeah. That would be the most insane cabinet. They would be completely untethered from precedent, law, or constitution, but, there we go.
You don't think that RFK could serve somewhere with his law background with the FDA or his work that he's done with the EPA or anything?
So I'll give you my limited experience with RFK. I brought him in for 3 days about 30 years ago. We went hiking, we hung out. He started, Natural Resources Defense Council. He did some good work. What is compelling to me is that if you listen and read the sort of testimony, if you will, of his current colleagues and of his long-term coworkers, they sort of point to a man who's become a little unreliable and unhinged. So I think on his good days, he's good, but I think there are some bad days that unhinge him a little.
Interesting.
He's probably not the guy I would pick for a cabinet position.
Okay. Well, what would you give Elon if you had the choice?
I would not give Elon anything. I would give Elon.
Would you let him be your advisor? Maybe not a cabinet position, but an advisor.
I see no evidence that Elon Musk is a good decision maker. Now, I know, send Heidi the hate mail about how successful Tesla is when it's not burning up and blowing up. But I mean, I do not think.
Burning up and blowing up, I thought might have been a space thing, not a car thing, but okay.
I do think that I am of the opinion that government is not business. And while you can take some characteristics of good organizational management, those who say you ran a business, therefore you couldn't run business, fundamentally do not understand public service, in my opinion.
All right.
And part of the challenge at the federal government especially is all the rules and regulations to promulgate this and that and the other. And the bureaucrats, if you will, in the agencies are basically, they got tenure. They're there. They're going to outlive you. And it's very challenging, especially for somebody who's an entrepreneur, to come into an agency like that and drive any meaningful change.
He has no experience.
Right?
Like, I feel like there's relevant experience, and then there's not relevant experience.
He'd be fun at parties, though, right?
Maybe. I mean, I'm assuming he requires drugs to come to these parties.
Elon Musk, you think he does drugs?
I
don't get out much, apparently.
Oh my gosh, he's infamously known for toking on one of his
I don't know
his board member calls.
Oh, interesting.
He loves
and some other podcasts he did. Yeah. I was going to ask, was he doing it with the Trump one?
That's a good question.
Maybe FDA.
Yeah.
Did they have a bag of Doritos next to him during the chat? I don't know. We didn't see any video of that, so
there you go.
I know.
DEA.
It could. That's a great role for
Could
him.
be.
Guns and drugs.
And before we get done, back to RFK for you. Do you think there would be a serious place for him in a Trump cabinet if Trump were reelected, or are you on Maura's where you can't take him seriously?
I don't think Trump would put him on. I mean, maybe if it's going to help him win the election, he can give him some token role as an advisor, but I don't see him in a cabinet position.
All right.
Especially because you then have to get Senate confirmation. I'm not sure either side of the Senate would really want to go along with that.
It'll be interesting watching this. The surprises, I think, are still going to come. I know it's not even September yet, and there still will be an October surprise. Is it going to be aliens coming down from space? We don't know. So exciting things yet to come. Thanks for staying here for this very policy-driven podcast today, talking real issues that you need to think about in Utah. So thanks for joining us, Mr. John Dougall, Maura Carabello. Thank you for being here. This has been fun.
Committee's going late.